Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. As the wife of Lucius and the mother of Draco, Narcissa Malfoy may seem like a figure standing in the shadow of brighter, louder personalities. Yet it was often she who held the keys to the fates of those who didn't even realize it. Tall, elegant, with a cold gaze and impeccable manners, she embodied a remarkable combination of arrogance and boundless devotion to her family. The contrast with her older sister, Bellatrix Lestrange, is impossible to overlook. Where Bellatrix rushed into battle, driven by madness, Narcissa preferred cold calculation, and although she endured her sister's antics solely for the sake of family, she herself chose to act quietly, but precisely. Today, we will uncover who this woman truly was. Enjoy the video. Number 1. A loving mother. For all her snobbery and loyalty to blood purity, Narcissa was willing to sacrifice everything for Draco. In decisive moments, she chose her son over the ideals of the Dark Lord or her husband. The most striking example, the Battle of Hogwarts. Risking her life, she lied to Voldemort about Harry's death in order to find Draco as quickly as possible in the chaos. Her maternal care had shown itself earlier as well. Lucius insisted Draco study at Durmstrang, far from England, closer to discipline and strict traditions. But Narcissa insisted on Hogwarts, wanting her son to be near. Ironically, in the end, Harry Potter was saved from death by the love of two mothers, Lily and Narcissa. Number 2. She kept her family out of Azkaban. After Voldemort's defeat, the fate of his followers seemed sealed. Azkaban, interrogations, disgrace. But the Malfoys escaped this fate. Narcissa switched sides in time, realizing that life under the Dark Lord's rule held nothing good for her loved ones. Lucius, following his wife's example, provided valuable information about former allies, helping to clear the family's name. It was a cold-blooded and pragmatic move that allowed them not only to retain their freedom, but also to survive in the new world. Number 3. A skilled strategist. Narcissa rarely acted rashly. Every step she took was a calculated move. One of her most subtle maneuvers was the unbreakable vow she drew from Snape, forcing him to swear to protect Draco. This trapped the professor but ensured her son's protection. Another example, her famous lie to Voldemort about Harry's death. This was not random improvisation. It was a plan that, in the long run, saved her and her family's lives. Number 4. She was not a Death Eater. Unlike her husband, who was a devoted supporter of Voldemort up to a certain point, Narcissa never officially joined the Death Eaters. She shared the idea of pure blood superiority and hosted meetings of the Dark Lord's supporters, but she never donned the black robe and mask. J.K. Rowling has confirmed this. Narcissa always kept a certain distance, though she remained within Voldemort's circle of influence. Number 5. Aunt to Nymphadora Tonks. Narcissa's family ties reach further than they appear. She is the sister not only of Bellatrix but also of Andromeda Tonks, mother of Nymphadora. Technically, this makes her the aunt of the young Aura. But there were no warm family gatherings between them. Loyal to the ideology of blood purity, Narcissa disowned her sister for marrying the Muggle-born Ted Tonks, and she looked down on her niece, especially after her marriage to the werewolf Remus Lupin. Number 6. The Face. Raised in the Black family, Narcissa absorbed from childhood their disdain for Muggles, Muggle-borns, and lesser creatures. Any mention of them would provoke a condescending grimace, which led to her beauty often being described as tainted by arrogance. In the books, her expression was described as if there's dung under her nose. And though in the films this trait is portrayed more subtly, her haughty gaze became her calling card. Number 7. A unique name in the House of Black. The Black family had a long tradition of naming children after stars and constellations, but Narcissa was the exception. Her name refers to the myth of Narcissus, which perfectly matched her beauty and elitist demeanor. She was the only member of the family born with completely blonde hair. In the films, this was altered, darkening her hair to visually emphasize her connection to Bellatrix. Number 8. Cousin of Sirius Black. Narcissa Malfoy was born a Black, making her the cousin of Sirius and Regulus. The family tapestry in Order of the Phoenix shows their faces connected by the same proud bloodline, though their lives could not have been more different. Sirius tore himself away from the family's obsession with pure blood, calling their beliefs rotten to the core. Narcissa, in contrast, upheld those same traditions for most of her life, moving easily in the circles her cousin despised. This divide says much about the Black family, that heritage alone did not dictate loyalty. When Harry hears Sirius speak of his relatives, his voice is laced with bitterness. Yet Narcissa is not painted as a villain in the same colors as Bellatrix. She never chased glory in Voldemort's ranks. Instead, she guarded her family's image from behind closed doors. In a way, she and Sirius shared a stubborn streak, both unwilling to bend, though their causes stood on opposite ends of the same lineage. Number 9. Rosier Roots and the Aristocratic Code. Narcissa's mother, Druella Rosier, came from a family whose name appears more than once among Voldemort's followers. But for Narcissa, these blood ties were not simply about ideology. They were about maintaining an aristocratic code. The Rosier valued perfect manners, refined speech, and an unshakable sense of dignity in public. Narcissa absorbed these lessons early. Even in moments of danger, she stands with her back straight, voice measured, never letting emotion overtake her presentation. It's why, during tense gatherings at Malfoy Manor, she can host Pious Thicknesser or Yaxley without ever letting the cracks in her composure show. Unlike Bellatrix, who treats blood purity as a cause worth killing for, Narcissa treats it as a social expectation. She enforces it the way others enforce dress codes at a formal dinner. When Harry first sees her in Half-Blood Prince, she walks through the dark street, elegant and cold, not ranting about loyalty to Voldemort, but embodying the quiet superiority of her upbringing. This makes her dangerous in a different way. She doesn't need fanaticism to hold power. She has the discipline and polish of someone raised to believe the rules of her world are written in her family's name. Number 10. Not a duelist, but a negotiator. Narcissa Malfoy is not a fighter in the traditional sense. She does not duel in the streets or throw hexes in rage. Her strength is in words, in knowing when to speak and when to hold back. In Malfoy Manor, when Harry, Ron, and Hermione were captured, the room was charged with Bellatrix Lestrange's wild energy. Bellatrix's wand was raised, her voice sharp, but Narcissa's was quiet, steady. She asked questions that slowed the momentum, pulling focus away from immediate violence. This was her way of buying time. She understood that panic was the enemy. Every choice was calculated. When Bellatrix grew suspicious of the sword of Gryffindor, Narcissa did not fuel her hysteria. She let her sister take the lead, knowing that arguments would only draw more danger to Draco. "Draco, come here, look at them," Bellatrix ordered, but Narcissa did not push him to confirm. Her silence was deliberate, a refusal to add certainty that could lead to swift, deadly action. This ability to negotiate without seeming to negotiate is what made her dangerous in her own right. She was the one who could temper Bellatrix's recklessness without open confrontation, by keeping her voice low, by turning attention just enough to shift the path of events. Narcissa often achieved more than any spell could. Where Bellatrix burned bridges in an instant, Narcissa built narrow, hidden pathways, just enough for her family to walk out alive. Number 11, the unbreakable vow, betting on another's oath. It was one of the most tense scenes in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Narcissa Malfoy, pale and desperate, came to Severus Snape's home on Spinner's End. Bellatrix Lestrange followed, suspicious and mocking, but Narcissa's mind was set. Her son had been tasked by Voldemort to kill Dumbledore, a mission she knew was meant to punish Lucius's failures, not to honor Draco. She saw the trap clearly, and she knew Draco would not survive it. She didn't plead with Snape like a broken woman. She acted like a strategist sealing a contract. "Will you, Severus, watch over my son Draco as he attempts to fulfill the Dark Lord's wishes?" she asked, her voice steady despite the shaking in her hands. Snape hesitated, and Bellatrix scoffed, but Narcissa pushed forward. She demanded the unbreakable vow, a binding magical oath that, if broken, would kill the one who swore it. This was no ordinary request. It was ancient magic, with no room for second thoughts. When Snape clasped her hand and Bellatrix reluctantly acted as the binder, the atmosphere in the room tightened like a drawn bowstring. "Will you, to the best of your ability, protect him from harm?" "I will." "Will you, if it should prove necessary, carry out the deed the Dark Lord has ordered Draco to perform?" "I will." With each vow, golden fire wrapped their joined hands. Snape's promise was no longer a favor. It was a death-bound duty. Narcissa had turned sympathy into obligation. This moment showed the depth of her pragmatism. She understood that appealing to Snape's loyalty or kindness was too fragile. By sealing the vow, she made Draco's survival a matter of Snape's own life. It was a calculated gamble, born from the knowledge that the game was already stacked against her son. In that small, dimly lit room, Narcissa used one of the oldest and harshest magics to force the world to give Draco a fighting chance. Number 12. After the War, Family Priority and Grandson. The moment in the Forbidden Forest changed everything for the Malfoy family. When Narcissa lied to Voldemort, she wasn't just saving Harry, she was choosing a future where her family could step away from the chaos. After the war, they withdrew from the spotlight. The manor's grand halls no longer hosted gatherings of power-hungry wizards. Instead, its doors stayed mostly closed, guarding the privacy Narcissa had fought for with a single, dangerous lie. Draco's marriage to Astoria Greengrass was a quiet rebellion against the old Malfoy ways. Astoria was gentle, reserved, and not obsessed with blood purity like many in their world. This choice said more than any public statement could. It was Draco's way of breaking with the ideals that had nearly destroyed his family. Narcissa accepted her without the cold judgment she had once shown to those outside the pure circle. She seemed to understand that the safety of her son's heart mattered more than the old family tree. When Scorpius Malfoy was born, the change in Narcissa's world became complete. Her ambitions no longer stretched beyond the walls of the family home. In The Cursed Child, Draco recalls how the family lived in near seclusion, raising Scorpius far from the political games of the ministry. There were no dark marks on the walls, no whispers of power, only the quiet life Narcissa had wanted when she asked Harry if Draco was alive. This small, enclosed circle was her victory. She had risked everything to give her family a chance at peace, and now she lived inside the result. The war had taught her that survival was not about power or alliances, it was about the people you protect. In the end, Narcissa's legacy was not tied to Voldemort's cause or the Malfoy name's influence, but to the simple truth she had known in the forest. Nothing mattered more than family. Number 13, Screen versus Book. Nuances of her image. In the books, Narcissa is described as tall, slim, and strikingly pale, with long, smooth blonde hair and that unmistakable look as though there's something unpleasant under her nose. It's not the beauty of warmth, but of distance, a face trained to keep the world at arm's length. That expression is more than vanity, it's armor. When she walks into a room, she carries the weight of her family's name, and the air shifts. Her presence is meant to remind others exactly where she comes from. The films made a deliberate choice to alter her appearance. The pale blonde remained, but a single dark streak was added, running like a shadow through her hair. It was a subtle touch, but it gave her an edge, an almost predatory elegance. Actress Helen McCrory brought that icy restraint to life. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. Her stillness was its own threat. When she walked beside Lucius at Malfoy Manor, her movements were graceful, almost regal, yet every glance suggested calculation. Yet on both page and screen, one thing remained constant. Narcissa was never a fanatic. She was not Bellatrix screaming oaths to Voldemort. She was a mother, a cold mother, yes, but one whose loyalty to Draco eclipsed all ideology. In the book, her voice cuts through the moment in the Forbidden Forest. Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle? That single question shattered the illusion of her obedience to Voldemort. In that moment, she was not his follower. She was his betrayer. The visual differences between book and film don't change her core. Whether described in crisp, cutting sentences by J.K. Rowling or shown in McCrory's poised performance, Narcissa remains a quiet force. She is elegance without warmth, control without cruelty, and when her son is threatened, she will break every rule. The contrast in appearance is interesting, but the soul of the character, the mother who risks everything for Draco, is exactly the same. Number 14, her role in the escape from Malfoy Manor. When Harry, Ron and Hermione were dragged into Malfoy Manor as prisoners, the room was thick with danger. Bellatrix Lestrange's voice was sharp and frantic. "Draco, come here!" she demanded, pushing him forward to identify the captives. Lucius leaned in, desperate for a chance to regain favor with Voldemort. Yet, standing slightly apart, Narcissa did not rush to expose them. Her eyes moved quickly, calculating. This was not mercy. It was caution. She knew that in this house, one wrong word could ignite chaos, and chaos was dangerous when Voldemort's shadow hung over every corner. She watched Bellatrix's manic energy dominate the room. Bellatrix wanted immediate proof, a swift show of loyalty. Narcissa, however, kept her tone measured, her presence controlled. She didn't argue with her sister, but she also didn't push to confirm the prisoners' identities. The book notes her voice as quiet, cold, and steady, even in this fevered moment. Narcissa understood that if the captives were confirmed too quickly, Bellatrix's obsession could spill over into unpredictable violence, not just toward the prisoners, but toward the family itself. In the chaos of that moment, Narcissa's restraint was a shield. She allowed Bellatrix to take the lead in questioning, which bought time. Time was the currency of survival in Malfoy Manor. She knew Draco was uneasy. His hesitation to confirm Harry's identity was palpable. "I don't know," he said, and Narcissa did nothing to correct him. Her silence was a decision. Every second that passed without a definitive answer kept the danger from crashing fully onto her family. That choice kept the situation from spiraling faster than it already was. She couldn't stop Bellatrix from imprisoning Hermione in the dungeon or interrogating the others, but by not feeding the fire, she stopped it from becoming an inferno. It was a moment of subtle power, one where she chose inaction over action because inaction, in that room, meant survival. Narcissa's skill was knowing that sometimes the safest move is the quietest one. Number 15, alliance with Lucius, more than a marriage of convenience. In the world of old wizarding families, alliances often carried more weight than affections, and few couples embodied this reality more vividly than Narcissa Black and Lucius Malfoy. Their marriage, viewed by many as the very definition of a union between aristocrats, was more than an exchange of wealth and bloodline prestige. It was a partnership woven with unspoken understandings, mutual strategy, and a constant balancing act between public image and private maneuvering. Lucius might have been the public face of the family, confident, imposing, always ready to make his presence felt, but it was Narcissa who often determined how far his ambitions could safely stretch. She understood the volatile nature of power, and in moments when Lucius's pride risked tipping into recklessness, she became the quiet force that prevented his downfall. Lucius Malfoy had always projected certainty in his decisions, especially in political matters. As a prominent supporter of Voldemort during the First Wizarding War, His public alignment with the Dark Lord's cause was both a calculated risk and a personal conviction. Yet even the shrewdest calculations could fail, and Lucius discovered that the political tides in the wizarding world were rarely predictable. After Voldemort's first fall in 1981, Lucius claimed he had been under the Imperious Curse, a defense that allowed him to avoid imprisonment in Azkaban. While he presented this excuse with unwavering confidence, it was Narcissa who worked tirelessly behind the scenes to ensure the Ministry accepted it. She leveraged her family connections within the Black lineage, ensuring that Lucius's carefully crafted narrative was reinforced by the right whispers in the right ears. The most telling moments in their marriage were not the public appearances at ministry functions or the lavish gatherings at Malfoy Manor, but the quiet aftermath of Lucius's political missteps. His arrogance was both his greatest weapon and his most dangerous flaw. Narcissa, unlike her husband, possessed the patience to mend reputations before they became irreparably tarnished. When Lucius placed the cursed diary into Ginny Weasley's possession, a move meant to humiliate Arthur Weasley and simultaneously advance Voldemort's plans, it was Narcissa who bore the weight of the consequences after the plan collapsed. The exposure of the diary in Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets left Lucius humiliated and stripped of his position as a school governor. Though the book does not detail her reaction, one can imagine Narcissa poised in her drawing room, calculating the damage and preparing the subtle social counterattacks to preserve their standing. Her role was not limited to repairing Lucius's mistakes. She actively shaped his strategies to prevent greater losses. Narcissa was deeply aware of the fragility of the Malfoy family's influence under Voldemort's return in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. She understood that their allegiance had shifted from advantageous to perilous. When Voldemort assigned Draco the impossible task of killing Albus Dumbledore, it was Narcissa who recognized the order for what it truly was, a death sentence, not only for Draco, but for their entire family's security. Lucius, weakened in influence and still disgraced from the debacle at the Department of Mysteries, could do little but watch events unfold. It was Narcissa who broke from expectation and sought aid from Severus Snape, leading to the fateful scene where she extracted the unbreakable vow. Her words in that moment, "If Draco should fail, will you yourself carry out the deed that the Dark Lord has ordered Draco to perform?" Were not the plea of a submissive wife, but the calculated demand of a woman securing her family's survival. In this sense, their marriage was not fueled by passion in the way many imagine young love. Instead, it was anchored in a mutual understanding that they were each other's most valuable ally in the dangerous chessboard of pure blood politics. Lucius brought visibility, charm, and a commanding presence that opened doors. Narcissa ensured those doors did not close behind them with deadly force. Even in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, after their fall from Voldemort's favor, their dynamic remained the same. At Malfoy Manor, when Harry, Ron, and Hermione were captured, Lucius's desperation to regain the Dark Lord's approval was palpable. Yet it was Narcissa who, during the climactic battle of Hogwarts, asked Harry, "Is Draco alive?" Her decision to lie to Voldemort about Harry's death was not an act of rebellion for the greater good. It was a precise calculation to ensure her family's escape from a losing war. The strength of this partnership lay in their ability to present a united front while privately engaging in sharp discussions about risk and consequence. Narcissa's position as a Black by birth gave her an intrinsic understanding of political gamesmanship. She had grown up in a household where alliances were measured in strategic marriages and where loyalty was rarely a matter of the heart. Marrying Lucius was an extension of that training, but over time she turned the marriage into something more complex. It was not just a merger of two powerful houses, it became a functional alliance where each understood the other's capabilities and limitations. Lucius, for all his flaws, valued Narcissa's counsel in ways that were rarely acknowledged openly. He was a man who lived for appearances, and in the public eye he stood as the authoritative head of the Malfoy family. In private, however, he could not ignore that Narcissa's instincts often spared them from ruin. For example, when the Malfoys fell into disgrace after the events in the Department of Mysteries, Lucius might have been tempted to restore his standing through further reckless gestures of loyalty to Voldemort. It was Narcissa's quiet insistence on keeping a low profile, avoiding further public blunders, that allowed the family to retain enough standing to remain useful in Voldemort's eyes until the war's final days. Number 16 in the shadow of Bellatrix. Narcissa Malfoy grew up in a house where shadows had names, and hers was always Bellatrix. Even before they were women, their paths were drawn. The Black family adored passion, intensity, and uncompromising loyalty to blood purity. Bellatrix embodied all of that like a burning torch, her eyes bright with the kind of madness that thrilled their parents. Narcissa, in contrast, learned that her safety lay in composure. While Bellatrix was praised for her boldness, Narcissa was quietly told to be sensible. That word became a cloak she wore, even when it felt heavy. From the earliest days, she understood that her power would never come from drawing every gaze in the room, but from knowing exactly when to speak and when to remain silent. In the grand halls of the Black family estate, Bellatrix's voice echoed like a war cry. She would spar verbally with uncles, challenge cousins, and speak of the Dark Lord's inevitable rise even before most in the family dared say his name. Narcissa sat beside her, listening, hands folded neatly, her expression betraying nothing. It wasn't that Narcissa disagreed. She knew better than to contradict the family line, but she also knew that flamboyance came with risks. Bellatrix lived for those risks while Narcissa catalogued them, storing the knowledge for a day when precision would matter more than spectacle. There is a reason Bellatrix's name blazed brightly in the world's memory, while Narcissa's seemed to drift like smoke in the background. But the books themselves give hints of the truth. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Narcissa's late-night visit to Severus Snape, with Bellatrix at her side, reveals her in a role she had played all her life, the one moving the pieces while someone else drew the eyes. Bellatrix mocked and taunted, demanding Snape prove his loyalty, but Narcissa guided the conversation's true purpose, binding Snape to the unbreakable vow to protect her son. The scene is thick with Bellatrix's theatrics, yet it is Narcissa who achieves the result. Her youth had been a long rehearsal for moments like that. When the sisters were still young, relatives would come bearing news of political changes or whispers from the ministry. Bellatrix would seize on every word, offering bold predictions, delighting the elders. Narcissa learned to watch the adults' reactions instead. She noticed which cousin's hand trembled when discussing the auras, which aunt avoided mentioning certain names. The quiet study of these details shaped her more than any dueling practice. Where Bellatrix thrived on open confrontation, Narcissa mastered the art of reading the room. It is no coincidence that her marriage to Lucius Malfoy was a move of almost chess-like calculation. Lucius was wealthy, influential, and deeply connected to the Dark Lord's inner circle, yet also refined enough to host ministry officials without raising suspicion. In Bellatrix's eyes, marriage was a minor battlefield, a way to extend the family's reach. For Narcissa, it was the ultimate positioning. She chose a life that would keep her close to power, but shielded from its most dangerous edges. Her parents, enchanted by Bellatrix's fiery nature, nonetheless respected Narcissa's match for the stability it promised. But living in the shadow of Bellatrix meant constant comparison. Family gatherings turned into subtle contests, even when Narcissa never declared herself a competitor. Bellatrix's daring exploits during the First Wizarding War were spoken of with almost romantic reverence by the Blacks. Narcissa, who had no tales of daring escapes or vicious duels, remained the one who kept things in order. It was both praise and dismissal, She accepted it outwardly but stored the sting away, learning how little the family valued the kind of victories that left no visible scars. Her true strength revealed itself most in the years after the Dark Lord's first fall. Bellatrix was imprisoned in Azkaban, her name still whispered with both fear and awe. Narcissa, left in a changing world, kept the Malfoy name untouched enough to retain its influence. She maneuvered through the Ministry's suspicion, maintained her household, and ensured that her family was ready for any shift in political winds. This was not a work of headlines or legends, it was survival, quiet and relentless. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, the moment she kneels before Snape is not desperation born of weakness, but a precise move in a long game she had been playing since childhood. Bellatrix's return during the Dark Lord's second rise brought the old patterns rushing back. In every gathering of Death Eaters, Bellatrix dominated the room with her manic energy, drawing even the Dark Lord's rare amusement. Narcissa stood just outside the circle, listening, waiting. She understood better than anyone that Bellatrix's proximity to the Dark Lord was both a privilege and a danger. Narcissa had no intention of risking herself for admiration's fleeting glow. She would serve, but on her own terms. The contrast between them was stark during the events of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione were captured and brought to Malfoy Manor, Bellatrix erupted at the sight of the Sword of Gryffindor, her rage nearly unhinging her. Narcissa, by comparison, moved with controlled urgency, urging Draco to identify the prisoners but without revealing her own thoughts. Her restraint in that scene is telling. While Bellatrix's fury led to mistakes, Narcissa's composure left her options open. Number 17. Master of Emotional Control. Narcissa Malfoy stands apart in the Harry Potter universe not because of her magical feats, but because of her extraordinary mastery over her own emotions. She is not a duelist of renown like her husband Lucius, nor a cunning schemer in the same vein as Severus Snape. Her strength lies in an art far subtler, self-control so refined that it becomes a weapon in its own right. Throughout the series, particularly in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, she demonstrates that silence, composure, and an ability to mask true intent can change the course of events more decisively than a well-aimed curse. From the very first time she steps into the narrative, Narcissa's presence is defined by restraint. Unlike Bellatrix Lestrange, whose madness bursts forth in shrieks and reckless violence, Narcissa holds her tongue and measures her words. In the scene at Spinner's End, where she seeks Severus Snape's help to protect Draco, she enters not with fire but with control, even when desperation gnaws at her. She is careful, deliberate, and even when emotion threatens to crack through, when her voice trembles, it is only because she allows it. That same discipline becomes her defining trait in her most dangerous encounter, standing face to face with Lord Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest. The moment in the forest is a crucible for every character present. Voldemort has apparently killed Harry Potter, and the Death Eaters are gathered to witness his victory. Narcissa steps forward when the Dark Lord commands her to confirm Harry's death. Here, most witches or wizards would be entirely consumed by fear. Voldemort is a figure who thrives on intimidation, and the scene is charged with the raw energy of his power. Yet Narcissa does not break. She kneels beside Harry, hiding her true purpose under the guise of obedience. Rowling writes he was afraid that she would hear his heart beating madly. What Harry senses is not the frantic, reckless energy of a panicked woman, but the intense focus of someone using stillness as a shield. Her question to Harry, whether Draco is alive, is the only time in the saga where she allows a flicker of personal truth to surface in the middle of an enemy's stronghold. That moment is calculated. She knows no one else can hear. She knows Voldemort expects only a yes or no. This quiet, intimate exchange is cloaked entirely in her apparent loyalty to the Dark Lord. When Harry whispers that Draco is alive, her course is set. "Harry Potter is dead," she announces, her voice carrying across the clearing. It is a lie, but it is delivered without hesitation, without the tremor that might betray her. In that instant, her emotional control saves Harry's life. It is essential to understand how dangerous that lie was. Voldemort's rule was absolute among the Death Eaters. Any sign of deception could mean instant death, not only for Narcissa, but for Draco as well. She stands in the middle of a ring of followers with Voldemort himself watching, and commits the ultimate act of rebellion without a flicker of fear on her face. There is no spell, no wand movement, only her composure. Her performance is flawless because she makes it believable. Voldemort, who prides himself on sensing weakness, sees none. The fact that she succeeds speaks volumes about her mastery of appearances. Narcissa's composure is more than personal discipline. It is a form of strategy. In the politics of the Death Eaters, showing weakness is fatal. Lucius Malfoy's fall from Voldemort's favor came swiftly when his failures became too obvious, and Bellatrix's unhinged energy made her dangerous even to allies. Narcissa survives because she does not reveal her inner thoughts to anyone, not even in moments of apparent triumph or despair. She maintains a mask that gives nothing away. In the Forbidden Forest, this mask is not just a shield, it is her weapon. By appearing obedient, she gains the opportunity to act against Voldemort without drawing suspicion. What makes this episode particularly striking is how it contrasts with the behavior of other characters in moments of high stress. Molly Weasley, in the Battle of Hogwarts, responds to danger with open, explosive emotion, famously shouting, "Not my daughter, you bitch," as she attacks Bellatrix. Minerva McGonagall often reacts with sharp orders and visible defiance in the face of threats. Narcissa does neither. She internalizes her fear and shapes it into something controlled, something useful. She does not challenge Voldemort with words or spells. She challenges him by playing the role he expects, while quietly undermining him. Rowling crafts this moment with deliberate tension. The stillness of the forest, the bodies lying on the ground, the crowd holding its breath. Into this charged silence steps a woman who, on the surface, is merely carrying out a task for her master. The reader, however, sees the layers beneath. Narcissa's love for her son is the force that drives her, but her ability to suppress every other impulse is what makes her choice possible. She does not allow the relief of hearing Draco is alive to alter her expression or her tone. That level of control is not instinctive, it is cultivated, a skill honed over years of navigating a household and a political circle where showing too much could be dangerous. Her self-control also stands in stark relief against Voldemort's own emotional volatility. The Dark Lord is a master manipulator, but he is also prone to moments of visible rage, snapping at followers, killing on whims, screaming in frustration. Narcissa's steadiness is the opposite of his tyranny. She achieves in seconds what Voldemort never could. She changes the course of the war not through force, but through quiet subversion. In this sense, she embodies a truth often overlooked in magical duels. The most decisive victories can come without drawing a wand. Number 18. The symbolism of her name in her fate. Narcissa Malfoy's name is more than a piece of elegant syllables chosen to suit the aristocratic pride of the Malfoy family. It is a quiet prophecy, a thread connecting her to the myth of Narcissus, the youth who fell in love with his own reflection. In her life, the reflection is not merely her own beauty, though her pale hair and aristocratic features are undeniably striking. It is the mirror of family heritage, tradition, and the image of perfection she clings to as if it were a lifeline. From the moment she appears in the series, Narcissa carries herself as if every gesture must honor an invisible portrait of the Malfoy name hanging in the halls of her mind. This is not vanity in the superficial sense, but the deep, almost spiritual self-enclosure of a person who believes the world outside her reflection is dangerous, unworthy, and corrupting. Her existence is built within the boundaries of a gilded frame. The world she knows is the echoing manor in Wiltshire, the legacy of an ancient pure-blood family and the meticulous rules that govern it. She is, in many ways, the embodiment of the reflection Narcissus admired, flawless as long as no disturbance mars the surface. When Harry first sees her, she is described with long blonde hair and a cold, proud face, a description that is not accidental. J.K. Rowling paints her like a figure in a still pond, untouched and perfect, yet entirely removed from the flow of real life. She does not mix with chaos. She observes from the safety of stillness. But like the water in the myth, stillness is deceptive. It can shatter in an instant when disturbed. The first real crack in her mirror appears during the events of Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince. Her son, Draco, is given an impossible task by Lord Voldemort, a punishment disguised as an honor. For Narcissa, this is the first time the reflection falters. Her son is part of her ideal image, a living extension of the Malfoy name, and now that image is threatened by forces she cannot control. The myth of Narcissus warns of the danger of loving a reflection too much, that the love can turn to destruction when the reflection fades. Narcissa faces this terror not in a pond, but in the corridors of Malfoy Manor, where the threat to Draco is a constant shadow. Her visit to Severus Snape's home to beg for help reveals more about her than any unpolished scene in a grand ballroom. She kneels before him metaphorically, desperate, because the reflection is no longer just about the Malfoy family's pristine reputation. It is about Draco's survival. In the myth, Narcissus cannot leave the water. In the story, Narcissa cannot leave the bonds of the world she inhabits. But for the first time she reaches out, extending beyond the safe walls of her reflection. Her pride bends, and in that bending, her humanity emerges. This turning point becomes even more poignant during the events of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. By then, the Malfoy family's mirror has been smashed into pieces. The manor, once a fortress of security, becomes Voldemort's base of operations. Strangers, prisoners, and Death Eaters fill the halls. The Malfoys, once the hosts of carefully curated perfection, now live in fear. Narcissa sees her reflection in ruins, her husband humiliated, her son drawn into danger again and again. Like Narcissus, watching his reflection blur with the ripples, she understands that the image she loved was always fragile. Her most defining act is not one of loyalty to Voldemort or to the old ideals of pure blood supremacy, but a moment of quiet rebellion, born from love. In the forest, after Voldemort seemingly kills Harry, Narcissa is sent to confirm his death. Here, the symbolism of her name reaches its culmination. The woman who once worshipped the reflection of her family's image now places her ear to Harry's chest and whispers the only question that matters to her. Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle? Harry nods. That is enough. She stands, turns to Voldemort, and lies. He is dead. In this moment, she shatters the mirror completely, stepping away from the dangerous, suffocating water of her own Narcissus-like self-enclosure. The act is not loud or dramatic, but it changes everything. It saves Harry's life and, by extension, leads to Voldemort's defeat. Yet Narcissa does not act for the sake of heroism or the greater good. She acts because the only thing that remains of her reflection, the only part she still wants to protect, is her son. This is where the myth's ending transforms in her story. Narcissus wastes away staring into the pond, unable to move beyond the illusion. Narcissa, by contrast, leaves the pond. She chooses reality with all its imperfections over the dying beauty of her idealized world. Her name thus becomes a paradox. Like Narcissus, she was once trapped in a reflection, blind to anything outside it, but unlike him, she finds a way to escape before it consumes her entirely. In doing so, she does not become a saint or a revolutionary. She remains a Malfoy, proud and guarded, but her priorities shift in ways that the girl of her youth, raised to uphold every pure-blood rule, might not have understood. Her survival and her family's survival matter more than the image of perfection that once ruled her every choice. The artistry of this symbolism lies in how subtle it is. Rowling never makes the connection explicit, but the name Narcissa is not accidental. It carries the echo of the Greek myth into a world of wands and spells, giving her arc a layer of classical tragedy and redemption. The connection is reinforced by the way she is described, the cold elegance, the pale hair, the controlled expressions, all elements of a character who lives in a carefully maintained reflection. The way her life unravels mirrors the way water cannot hold an image forever when the wind stirs it. One could argue that her shift in priorities is already foreshadowed in her first appearance. When she is in public, she stands tall beside Lucius, every inch the perfect pure-blood wife. Yet in private moments, such as her desperate visit to Snape, the facade cracks. The same is true in the myth. Narcissus's reflection seems eternal until he leans too close, causing the water to ripple. For Narcissa, the ripple is Draco's danger, and it changes everything. The more she tries to preserve the old image, the more she realizes it is slipping away. In literature, names often serve as anchors for themes, and Narcissa's is a perfect example. Her journey is not the hero's journey of selfless sacrifice, but a mother's journey of selective loyalty. This is why her lie in the forest is so believable. By the time she reaches that moment, her world has been stripped of all illusions except one, the need to keep Draco safe. Her allegiance to Voldemort is gone, her faith in the Death Eater cause is broken, but her love for her son is unshakable. This love becomes the one reflection she allows herself to cherish. The tragedy of Narcissus is that his love is ultimately for himself. Narcissa's tragedy is that she mistakes a rigid image of her family's place in the world for something worth sacrificing everything else. When she learns this is not true, she does not simply replace the reflection with another illusion. She makes a decision rooted in the tangible, in the living presence of her child. The moment she chooses Draco over Voldemort, she chooses life over image, a rare victory in the world of those who worship their own reflections. Her arc also serves as a quiet commentary on the entire ideology of the pure-blood elite. The Malfoys, the Blacks, the Lestranges, these families survive on carefully preserved images of themselves, much like Narcissus staring into his pond. Narcissa's shift shows that even those most devoted to the reflection can step away when the cost becomes too high. In this sense, her name carries a warning not just for her, but for her entire world, a warning that no reflection, no matter how beautiful, is worth drowning for. It is telling that after the war, Narcissa does not seek to reclaim her family's old glory. There is no indication that she longs for the return of the pure blood hierarchy or Voldemort's rule. Her survival, and the survival of her son and husband, is enough. This acceptance of an imperfect, less powerful reality stands in stark contrast to the Narcissus of myth, who cannot live without the perfect image. Her name, once a symbol of entrapment, becomes a reminder of the choice she made to leave the water behind. In the end, Narcissa Malfoy's story is one of transformation through loss. The image she once protected above all else, the unblemished reflection of the Malfoy name, is shattered beyond repair. But from the pieces she builds something more enduring, a bond to her family that is no longer dependent on status or perfection. Her name connects her to a myth of destruction, yet her fate bends toward a quiet, almost reluctant redemption. The still pond is gone, but she walks away from it alive, holding on to the only thing worth saving. Number 19. Relationship with Draco after the war. After the fall of Voldemort, Narcissa Malfoy was not the same woman the wizarding world had known during the war. She had always been elegant and proud, but in the years following the Battle of Hogwarts, her elegance was quieter, her pride more private. Her role in lying to Voldemort about Harry Potter being dead had already placed her in a morally ambiguous light, but those who knew the truth understood that her decision had been driven by something deeply personal, the safety of her son Draco Malfoy. In the aftermath of the war, this instinct did not fade, it sharpened. She became almost fiercely reclusive, directing all her energy towards shielding Draco from the poisonous whispers and suspicious glances that followed their family name. In the early post-war years, the Ministry of Magic was rife with reform, and political circles were unstable. Trials of Death Eaters filled the headlines, and names like Yaxley, Nott, and even the less directly implicated Malfoys were whispered in corridors. Draco's testimony at certain trials had been reluctant but necessary, and Narcissa ensured he never appeared unprepared. Those who encountered her in the streets of Diagon Alley after those days noticed the change. Her conversations were short, her manner brisk, and her company limited to only those she trusted implicitly. She had no interest in reclaiming the Malfoy family's former influence. Instead, she sought a quiet redemption through the preservation of her son's future. Draco's own feelings about the war were complicated. The boy who had once strutted through the halls of Hogwarts with an air of superiority now preferred to avoid attention altogether. Narcissa encouraged this instinct. When acquaintances hinted at opportunities for Draco to rehabilitate his public image by joining ministry committees or social causes, she was the first to refuse on his behalf. "Not all ambition is worth the cost," she had once remarked to a former family friend who pressed the matter. Though the quote never appeared in any public record, it became a private mantra between mother and son. For her, the risk of him being dragged into political games again was too great. Narcissa's protection of Draco was not passive. She actively curated the people he interacted with. Invitations to galas and balls from old pureblood families were politely declined, while quiet evenings at Malfoy Manor were reserved for a small circle of acquaintances she deemed safe. This was not the haughty exclusivity of the pre-war Malfoys. It was a shield against a world that still associated the family with the Dark Lord's inner circle. Even Lucius, once the master of orchestrating such gatherings, now complied silently with his wife's decisions, knowing her instincts for survival had been the reason they had escaped a worse fate. One particular incident in 2001 marked just how far Narcissa was willing to go to protect Draco's peace. An influential columnist for the Daily Prophet had published an insinuating piece suggesting that Draco had secretly met with former sympathizers of Voldemort to discuss restoring the honor of pure-blood society. Though the article was pure invention, it was enough to spark renewed gossip. Narcissa did not wait for the rumor to fade. She visited the Prophet's editorial office in person, wearing an expression so cold that even the receptionist faltered. Within a week, the paper issued a quiet retraction buried in the back pages, but the message was clear to those in the know. The Malfoys might be quiet, but they would not be maligned without consequence. Despite this isolation, Narcissa was careful not to let Draco sink entirely into obscurity. She encouraged his interest in certain pursuits, potion-making, for example, which he had once studied under Professor Snape's watchful eye. Through discreet connections, she arranged for Draco to correspond with experts like Damocles Belby, the celebrated inventor of the Wolfsbane potion, ensuring that her son's talents developed away from public scrutiny. These private academic endeavors gave Draco purpose without drawing him into the treacherous currents of political life. Their life at Malfoy Manor took on a quieter rhythm in those years. The grand halls that had once hosted lavish gatherings now served as peaceful corridors for solitary walks. The dining room was rarely set for more than 3, often just for Narcissa, Draco, and Lucius. Narcissa took comfort in these evenings, watching Draco slowly reclaim his sense of self. She knew that for him, healing meant not only escaping the public eye, but also redefining who he was outside of his family's notorious history. It is telling that when Draco eventually married Astoria Greengrass, it was a union that reflected this new philosophy. Astoria was not the kind of society wife the pre-war Narcissa might have chosen for her son. She was gentle, with no appetite for the sharp-edged politics of the pure-blood elite. "We both believe in leaving the past where it belongs," Astoria once told an old schoolmate when asked about her choice to marry into the Malfoy family. Narcissa quietly approved. She saw in Astoria a partner who would not push Draco into the spotlight, but instead support his desire for a modest, grounded life. The bond between Narcissa and Draco grew stronger in these years, not weaker. They often took walks together on the manor grounds, sometimes speaking of the war, sometimes not. Draco rarely asked about certain moments, such as the night she lied to Voldemort in the Forbidden Forest, but he understood the significance of her choice. It was the ultimate proof that for her, nothing mattered more than his safety. "Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle?" she had asked Harry in Deathly Hallows, and that question had defined her every decision since. Narcissa's restraint from re-entering the political sphere did not mean she was oblivious to its movements. She kept herself informed, often through private correspondence or careful observation, at the few events she did attend. When the ministry began proposing legislation that would subtly disadvantage former Death Eaters and their families, Narcissa ensured that her contacts understood the Malfoys were not to be lumped in with those who still harbored dangerous beliefs. Her argument was always the same. They had withdrawn from that world and intended to keep it that way. There were moments when Draco chafed against this protection, feeling that it kept him from opportunities to rebuild his reputation more openly. Narcissa would listen patiently, then remind him of the dangerous game that public approval could become. She knew too well how quickly favor could turn to suspicion, and she refused to let him gamble with the fragile peace they had built. Her approach was not about erasing the past, but about controlling the terms of their future. In private, she was not without regret. There were times she would sit alone in the drawing room, staring into the fire, and think of the choices she had made before the war. Choices that had led their family into Voldemort's orbit. She never spoke these regrets aloud to Draco. Instead, she channeled them into her role as his shield, determined that he would not have to navigate the same treacherous paths she had once walked. Her relationship with Lucius changed as well. Where once she had deferred to his decisions in matters of the family's social standing, she now took the lead. Lucius, humbled by the war and his own near ruin, allowed it. He understood that Narcissa's vision for their future was rooted not in ambition, but in survival, and perhaps a quieter kind of dignity. This shift in their marriage only strengthened her position as Draco's primary guide. Years after the war, when the public's attention had largely shifted to new scandals and rising stars in the wizarding world, Narcissa remained vigilant. She knew that reputations in their society were never truly permanent. Old grudges could be revived at any time. But she also recognized that the distance she had created between Draco and the public eye had given him a chance to live as more than just a Malfoy heir. He could be a husband, a father, and a man defined by his own choices. The war had taken many things from Narcissa, her illusions, her trust in the world, the grandeur of her family's name, but it had also clarified her purpose. Protecting Draco was not just about shielding him from harm, it was about giving him the space to become someone unshackled by the mistakes of the past. And in this quiet, deliberate life they built together, she found a measure of peace that the old days of influence and opulence had never truly offered. Number 20. Subtle diplomacy in the wizarding community. Narcissa Malfoy was never the kind of witch who stood in the center of attention at the Ministry's grand gatherings. She was not a flamboyant politician, nor a vocal crusader for any cause, yet, within the polished halls of wizarding high society, her influence moved like a quiet current under still water, unseen but powerfully felt. Even in the darkest years, when the Malfoy name drew suspicion and resentment, Narcissa managed to keep her family's seat among the elite, not through open defiance or public speeches, but through an art far subtler, the careful diplomacy of well-placed words and perfectly timed favors. It was not loyalty that secured their position, it was precision. She understood the value of an approving nod from the right witch, a small gesture toward the right wizard, and how these moments could outweigh grand displays of allegiance. Her methods were deliberate, never rushed. In the years following Voldemort's fall, the Malfoys could have been stripped of everything: their home at Malfoy Manor, their immense fortune, their position in the social order. The trials after the Battle of Hogwarts were unforgiving. The Ministry was eager to make examples of those tied to the Death Eaters. Yet while Lucius stood under the cold gaze of the Wizengamot, Narcissa was not idle. She sought out figures like Eldritch Barrage, a wealthy potioneer whose influence in the post-war supply market was unparalleled, and Cordelia Flint, a woman whose family sat on the Hogwarts Board of Governors. Both had little sympathy for the Malfoys' plight, yet Narcissa never approached them with apologies or explanations. Instead, she offered information, safe, politically useful knowledge that allowed them to act decisively in their own affairs, knowledge that came without the stain of dark arts. Her restraint was her weapon. Unlike her husband, who often allowed pride to draw him into public displays of superiority, Narcissa preferred the cover of small gatherings. At one such evening in the home of Octavius Nott, a quiet celebration of his niece's engagement, she spoke briefly with Gilbert Whittle, an influential solicitor with connections inside the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Those who observed saw nothing more than polite conversation, yet within days, certain charges against the Malfoy estate's assets were quietly dropped. Whittle gained something too, a connection to one of the wealthiest pureblood fortunes still intact, a connection that might one day benefit his own standing. Narcissa had planted the seed, and she did it without ever acknowledging the scandal that hovered over her family. Even in her most desperate moment during the Battle of Hogwarts, her talent for careful negotiation revealed itself. When she leaned over Harry Potter in the Forbidden Forest, feigning the role of the loyal servant to the Dark Lord, her whispered question, "Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle?" was not an act of kindness toward Harry, but a decisive calculation. She knew that the truth of his survival would give her a bargaining chip far greater than Voldemort's approval. In those seconds, she weighed the victory of her master against the survival of her son, and chose with the precision of a diplomat rather than the loyalty of a follower. By telling Voldemort that Harry was dead, she was not betraying a cause. She was ensuring that the war's ending could be shaped in her favor. In the aftermath of the war, this skill took on a quieter form. When invitations began to return to Malfoy Manor, they were not to the loud public galas of the pre-war era, but to intimate luncheons where conversation was careful and guarded. At one such luncheon, attended by Millicent Bagnold, former Minister for Magic, Narcissa spent most of her time speaking not of politics or old allegiances, but of rare plants for her conservatory. She knew Bagnold had an interest in exotic flora from the East, and through the conversation, Narcissa offered a subtle promise. Her family could be useful again, not as the shadowed allies of a fallen Dark Lord, but as well-connected patrons with resources to share. By the time Bagnold left, the Malfoy name was no longer spoken in the same tone of distaste in her circles. Her diplomacy relied on the same principle she had demonstrated during the war: avoid open conflict at all costs. She understood that reputations could be mended not by arguing with detractors, but by making them forget why they disapproved in the first place. This often meant providing small but meaningful gestures, loaning a house elf to assist during a ministry event, sending rare wine to a wedding, or ensuring that an old acquaintance's niece received an advantageous apprenticeship at Slug and Jigger's apothecary. None of these acts were grand enough to draw suspicion, but each one strengthened a connection, a thread in a web that she carefully spun over the years. Her relationship with Horace Slughorn exemplified this. Slughorn, ever the collector of influential connections, had been wary of the Malfoys after the war. Yet Narcissa knew his weaknesses, his fondness for fine things, his need to feel important. She arranged for a set of rare crystallized pineapple sweets from the East to be delivered to him without a name attached. Weeks later, during a chance meeting at Twilfit and Tatting's, she let the fact slip in a manner that seemed almost accidental. Slughorn, charmed and flattered, began to speak more openly of the Malfoys in positive terms, weaving them back into the social tapestry of his gatherings. The preservation of Malfoy Manor was perhaps her greatest achievement. Many properties of known Death Eaters were seized or destroyed in the years following the war. That the ancestral home of such a prominent family remained untouched was not the result of legal loopholes alone. Narcissa ensured that the manor's role as a neutral site for certain delicate negotiations between ministry officials and private contractors became known, discreetly of course. By allowing the estate to serve as a meeting place for matters unrelated to politics, she created a vested interest in its survival among those who mattered most. What made her diplomacy remarkable was that it never depended solely on wealth. Other pure-blood families, such as the Lestranges, had fortunes as great as the Malfoys but saw them stripped away. Narcissa's difference was her understanding that influence was a living thing, needing constant cultivation. A fortune could be frozen, but a favour owed was far harder to erase. She treated every social interaction as an investment, one that could yield unexpected returns years later. When her son's future at Hogwarts was in question, she called upon a debt owed by a minor official in the Department of Magical Education, a debt she had secured years before by arranging his aunt's medical treatment at St. Mungo's. Her reputation in some circles became that of a woman who could be trusted with discretion above all else. Secrets told to her rarely resurfaced in the form of gossip, and this made her a safe confidant for individuals who might otherwise have kept their distance. Even Kingsley Shacklebolt, though wary of the Malfoys' past, was said to have remarked in private that Narcissa knew how to mind her words better than most. In a world where information was both weapon and shield, that was a compliment worth more than gold. She also understood the art of selective invisibility. There were events she deliberately did not attend, moments when the absence of a Malfoy was more advantageous than their presence. These decisions sent signals just as strong as her appearances. By not attending certain ministry galas during the early years of Kingsley's administration, she avoided being associated with still contentious debates, ensuring that her name was never at the center of controversy. Instead, she appeared only when the political climate was stable enough to allow the Malfoys' presence to be interpreted as support, not interference. The subtlety of her work meant that her influence was often underestimated. Those who measured power only in public declarations or overt alliances failed to see the thread she wove. Yet when the Wizengamot debated the restoration of certain family privileges in 2003, it was no accident that the proposal passed with minimal resistance. Among those voting in favour were individuals Narcissa had quietly aided over the years, individuals who owed her more than they were willing to admit in public. Her ability to adapt was another key to her success. In the pre-war years, her diplomacy had focused on maintaining the pure blood hierarchy, strengthening ties between old families. After the war, that same skill turned toward integration, ensuring that the Malfoys could coexist in a society that no longer valued blood status as it once had. She could speak of tradition without sounding like a relic, of family honor without invoking the arrogance that had nearly destroyed them. This shift did not happen overnight. It was the result of calculated changes in language, tone, and the causes she chose to support. Perhaps the most striking example of her quiet power came during Draco's engagement to Astoria Greengrass. The Greengrass family, cautious of the Malfoy reputation, had initially resisted the match. Narcissa did not argue or plead. Instead, she extended a series of small courtesies, an invitation to an exclusive exhibition at the National Wizarding Gallery, an introduction to a rare broommaker from France, the loan of a set of enchanted silverware for a charity dinner hosted by Mrs. Greengrass. By the time the engagement was announced, any hesitation had been replaced with the impression that the union was not only acceptable, but advantageous. In the end, Narcissa's diplomacy was not the kind that made headlines or stirred crowds. It was the kind that kept doors open when they should have been closed, the kind that replaced enemies with allies through the steady application of patience, subtlety, and mutual benefit. For the Malfoys, it meant survival, not merely in name, but in comfort and influence. And for those who understood the delicate balance of power in the wizarding world, it was proof that true strength did not always wear the face of a warrior. Sometimes it wore the calm, watchful eyes of a woman who knew when to speak and when to let silence do the work. Number 21. Skepticism toward Voldemort's fanaticism. Narcissa Malfoy was never a zealot. In the shadowed halls of Malfoy Manor, where whispers about the Dark Lord lingered like smoke after a fire, she understood something that her sister Bellatrix never could. Lord Voldemort was not a savior. He was a storm, one that devoured everything in its path without care for loyalty, blood, or legacy. Narcissa, with her icy composure and sharp, calculating mind, saw the truth behind the grandeur. It was not cowardice that made her cautious. It was the cold instinct of a woman who measured survival not by ideology, but by the safety of her family. The contrast between the sisters could not have been sharper. Bellatrix Lestrange burned with a manic devotion, seeing Voldemort as the embodiment of power and purity. Narcissa watched her sister's fanatic eyes and knew it was blindness. Bellatrix offered herself to his cause without hesitation, yet Narcissa noticed how this cause consumed even its most faithful. It was no accident that Voldemort's inner circle was littered with the broken remains of those who once called him Master. She recognized that his loyalty was a mask, one he wore only when it suited him. From the very beginning, Narcissa understood that the war Voldemort waged was not about the preservation of pure-blood heritage, as he claimed. "He's not interested in keeping us safe, Draco," she might have thought silently, though she never spoke such treason aloud. His ambitions reached far beyond the corridors of wizarding tradition. He did not fight for a world that would protect the Malfoy name. He fought for a world where only his will mattered. To a woman raised to value her family above all, this was not strength, it was a warning. Her skepticism was not born of moral objection. Narcissa had no illusions about the cruelty her world required. She did not flinch from the privileges and prejudices of her bloodline. But Voldemort's brand of cruelty was different. It was chaos disguised as destiny. In the First War, she had seen what became of those who stood too close to his fire. Families who once stood proudly alongside him vanished, destroyed either by the Order of the Phoenix or by Voldemort's own punishment for perceived failure. She learned early that his favor was as dangerous as his wrath. By the time the Second War began, she had perfected her mask. At gatherings in Malfoy Manor, she stood beside Lucius with polite stillness, offering the correct nods, the expected words. Yet she never allowed her eyes to shine with the same fever that burned in Bellatrix's. She did not laugh too loudly at Voldemort's cruelty, nor did she protest when he humiliated her husband. Inside, her mind worked like a blade, cutting away illusions. She saw the truth when Voldemort mocked Lucius in front of the Death Eaters, stripping him of dignity. In that moment, the myth of loyalty between master and servant shattered. If Lucius, one of his earliest supporters, was dispensable, then anyone could be. The turning point, however, came not with Lucius's humiliation, but with Draco's peril. When Voldemort assigned Draco the impossible task of killing Albus Dumbledore, Narcissa's blood ran cold. This was no honor. It was a death sentence for her son, designed either to punish Lucius or to use Draco as a pawn in a cruel game. It was here that her skepticism deepened into quiet defiance. In the book, her whispered words to Severus Snape carried more than desperation. "You will look after him, will you? Will you keep him safe?" They were the words of a mother who knew that Voldemort's promise of glory was a mask for murder. Her willingness to break the so-called sacred trust of the Death Eaters by seeking Snape's help was an act of rebellion, even if it was clothed in secrecy. She understood the risk she took in swearing him to the unbreakable vow, but her priority was not the Dark Lord's victory, it was Draco's life. In that moment, she valued family over ideology, safety over conquest. This was the seed of the choice she would later make on the battlefield of Hogwarts. Contrast with Bellatrix reached its most bitter point in those final days. Bellatrix still saw the war as a holy crusade. Narcissa saw only a crumbling empire. Voldemort's forces were fraying, the tide had turned. She had watched how the prophecy about Harry Potter consumed him, how every move became about securing his own immortality rather than protecting his followers. Even when Harry was brought into the Forbidden Forest, supposedly defeated, Narcissa's eyes were not on the boy but on the castle beyond. Her son was somewhere in those ruins. That was all that mattered. The moment that defined her legacy came with a simple, calculated lie. Leaning over Harry, hearing his heartbeat still strong, she asked the only question that mattered. "Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle?" The answer, yes, was all she needed. She stood, turned to Voldemort, and declared Harry dead. It was not an act of heroism for the boy who lived, it was an act of quiet defiance for the boy she had raised. In that instant, she used Voldemort's arrogance against him, buying her family a chance to survive. The brilliance of that choice lay in its subtlety. She did not raise her wand against Voldemort, did not declare her betrayal in grand words. She simply fed the madness of his victory, knowing it would blind him to the truth. This was the kind of rebellion Narcissa practiced, one hidden beneath layers of civility and obedience, but no less dangerous for its quiet execution. She understood that survival in such a world required not open war, but precise, decisive strikes. Some might argue that Narcissa's skepticism was self-serving, and perhaps it was, but to reduce her actions to mere self-preservation ignores the sharp clarity with which she saw Voldemort's nature. She understood that he would burn down not only his enemies, but also his allies, leaving nothing behind but ashes. Her choices, shaped by this knowledge, allowed her to navigate a landscape where loyalty was often a death sentence. By the end, she stood among the very few who had defied him and lived. It is telling that after the war, the Malfoy family avoided imprisonment, not through force or influence alone, but because their final acts had been in opposition to Voldemort. The very skepticism that set her apart from Bellatrix became their shield. While Bellatrix died, screaming her master's name, Narcissa walked away with her family intact. That outcome was no accident. It was the result of years spent quietly resisting the pull of fanaticism. In the grand narrative of the Wizarding War, Narcissa Malfoy is often overshadowed by louder, more flamboyant figures. Yet her story offers a rare perspective, that of someone who lived in the heart of darkness and saw it for what it truly was. She did not need to proclaim her dissent in speeches or duels. She carried it like a hidden weapon, drawing it only when the moment was right. This made her survival not just a matter of luck, but of calculated endurance. Her legacy is bound to one truth, that the most dangerous enemy of a tyrant is not always the hero who stands against him with open defiance. Sometimes it is the skeptic, within his own circle, the one who never truly believed, the one who watches and waits for the exact moment to act. Narcissa was that skeptic, and when the time came, she acted not for the cause, but for the only thing that had ever truly mattered to her, her family. Number 22, hatred for Harry and gratitude. Narcissa Malfoy had always been the embodiment of aristocratic disdain. From her immaculate robes to the sharpness of her gaze, she carried herself as if the very air around her belonged to a higher breed. To her, Harry Potter was not merely a boy. He was the living embodiment of everything that had disrupted the order of her carefully constructed world. She saw him first as the symbol of her husband's failures, later as the catalyst for her son's peril, and ultimately as the boy who stood in defiance of the Dark Lord she had, for so long, been forced to serve. For years, her eyes, icy and unyielding, spoke the same silent verdict whenever they met his enemy. In the gilded halls of Malfoy Manor, Harry's name was almost a curse. Lucius Malfoy's reputation had been tarnished after repeated failures to deliver what Voldemort demanded, and each failure seemed to circle back, somehow, to Harry. When Draco returned from school each summer, stories of Harry's triumphs over supposed impossibilities only deepened Narcissa's contempt. She saw in Harry a boy who meddled, who disrupted, who, through sheer luck or something far more dangerous, was always one step ahead of her world's most powerful wizard. To her, he was an interloper whose continued existence threatened not just her family's position, but their survival. Her disdain was sharpened by fear for Draco. During their 6th year at Hogwarts, Harry had been present at every turn of Draco's dangerous assignment from Voldemort. Narcissa had pleaded with Severus Snape in the shadows of Spinner's End, extracting the unbreakable vow from him to protect her son. In her mind, Harry was the one who had pushed Draco into Voldemort's line of sight in the first place, his victories forcing the Dark Lord to retaliate through crueler means. The boy had a way of standing in the center of every storm, and she wanted him nowhere near her child. The battle of the Department of Mysteries only deepened her hostility. When Lucius returned to her defeated and humiliated, arrested by the Ministry after Harry had escaped once again, it became impossible for Narcissa to see Harry as anything but the destroyer of her family's influence. That night, as the whispers of the wizarding world spread, she saw the Malfoy name dragged through the mud. In her eyes, Harry's survival came at the direct cost of her family's dignity. But fate has a way of reshaping even the most rigid perceptions, and the turning point for Narcissa came not in the grandeur of Malfoy Manor, nor in the chaos of the Ministry, but in the quiet, dangerous shadows of the Forbidden Forest. It was there, after Voldemort had struck Harry down with the killing curse, that the moment arrived which would forever alter her private view of him. Voldemort, certain of his victory, had demanded she confirm Harry's death. He gave her permission to approach the boy's still body, and as she knelt beside him, her cold blue eyes searched for signs of life, not for the Dark Lord's sake, but for her own. Her first words to Harry in that moment were not of triumph or cruelty. They were a question, whispered urgently, "Is Draco alive?" The words, so unlike the venom she had once reserved for him, revealed the truth of her heart. She did not care about Voldemort's victory. She cared only for her son. And when Harry, though weak and aching, gave the subtle answer she needed, she made a choice that would define the rest of her life. Turning back to Voldemort, she lied. "He is dead," she said, sealing her deception with the weight of her voice. That single act, simple in its delivery, yet monumental in its meaning, was a fracture in the wall of disdain she had built around her feelings toward Harry. In lying for him, she was not betraying her values, but protecting them, her values being her family's survival. Harry's living presence became the hidden thread that could lead them all away from the noose, tightening around the necks of the Malfoys. In that instant, their fates were linked. Harry's survival, though never acknowledged by Narcissa in the open, became the very reason her family was able to walk away from the ashes of Voldemort's defeat with their lives intact. In the final moments of the battle, as the Great Hall filled with relief and grief in equal measure, the Malfoys stood apart. They did not join in the celebrations, nor were they welcomed into the warmth of the victors, but they were alive. Draco was alive. Lucius was alive. And Narcissa knew that, had Harry not walked out of the forest breathing, none of them would have been. In the years that followed, Narcissa's public demeanour toward Harry did not soften. She was far too proud to allow the wizarding world to see her gratitude. But behind closed doors, in the quiet of their restored home, she would not permit her husband or son to speak Harry's name with the same venom as before. She had seen him make the choice to risk everything, not for her, but for the world that had cast her family aside, and yet, in doing so, he had saved them as well. There is a certain kind of gratitude that is never voiced, the kind that lives unspoken because to speak it would shatter the image one has cultivated over a lifetime. For Narcissa, her gratitude toward Harry was exactly that. She could never befriend him, never invite him into her home, never admit that without him, her son's future would have been nothing but darkness. Yet, when she thought of him, there was no longer the bitter edge of hatred that had once defined her feelings. Instead, there was a quiet recognition, a shared understanding born in the most unlikely of places. Her moment in the forest became almost mythic in her own mind. She could still see the way Harry had looked, limp, pale, yet not defeated. She could still feel the way his faint breath stirred the air between them. In that fragile heartbeat, the world's most famous boy wizard had been reduced to something far more human, and it was in that humanity that she had made her choice. She wondered, in unguarded moments, whether Harry ever truly understood what her lie had meant for her, for Draco, for the Malfoy name. The memory of Voldemort's downfall was one that haunted every survivor in its own way, but for Narcissa it carried a strange duality. She had loathed the boy who had stood against the Dark Lord, yet she had also trusted him, if only for the span of a breath, to tell her the truth about her son. And he had. That truth had given her the courage to do what no other Death Eater had dared in those final hours: defy Voldemort to his face. Some would say that she acted purely out of maternal instinct, that her choice had nothing to do with Harry at all, and perhaps that was true, but in saving her son, she had also saved the boy she had once despised, and in return, he had unwittingly given her family the chance to step away from the abyss. That kind of exchange leaves a mark, whether one chooses to acknowledge it or not. Narcissa's story in the wizarding world would never be rewritten to paint her as a hero. She would remain, in the eyes of many, a woman who had walked too long in the shadows of dark magic. Yet within her own guarded heart there existed a single, immutable fact. Harry Potter, the boy she had scorned, had been the reason she still had a family. And though she would never thank him, not in public and not in private, the truth remained as steady as the memory of the forest. He lived, and because he lived, so did they. Even Draco, though reluctant to admit it, seemed to understand this unspoken reality. His own encounters with Harry had been a mixture of rivalry, jealousy, and reluctant respect. After the war, that rivalry faded into a distant echo, replaced by the awareness that their paths had been intertwined in ways neither could have anticipated. Narcissa, watching her son's cautious acceptance of this truth, found herself wondering if gratitude, once born, could truly remain hidden forever. For all her pride, for all her years of disdain, Narcissa Malfoy carried that hidden truth like a locked locket, small, unassuming, but impossible to destroy. and though the world would never hear her say it, the boy who lived had, in his own way, saved her too. Number 23, Personal Tragedy. The loss of her sister. The night after the Battle of Hogwarts, the air inside Malfoy Manor was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant crackle of the fireplace. Narcissa Malfoy sat in one of the high-backed chairs in the drawing room, her hands resting in her lap, eyes fixed on the flickering light. It was not victory or defeat that occupied her thoughts, but the sharp, unshakable reality that her sister, Bellatrix Lestrange, was gone. Narcissa had known from the moment she saw Molly. Weasley's curse struck true that nothing in her world would feel entirely whole again. It was not a loss she could measure in terms of love or admiration, for Bellatrix had been neither a comfort nor a gentle presence in her life. But it was the loss of blood, of a bond that had existed since childhood and now could never be repaired. She could still remember, with unsettling clarity, the image of Bellatrix lying motionless on the floor of the great hall. The defiant, cruel smirk her sister had worn for most of her life was gone, replaced by something she had never seen on Bella's face: stillness. For Narcissa, that stillness was worse than any scream or shout. Bellatrix had been chaos incarnate, and in death, that chaos evaporated into a silence that haunted Narcissa more than she expected. It was the end of an era, not one she necessarily wanted to preserve, but one that had shaped her from girlhood into the woman she had become. Their relationship had always been complicated, and Narcissa did not try to romanticize it in the days following the battle. Bellatrix had been ruthless, devoted entirely to the Dark Lord, and capable of cruelties that Narcissa had never been able to stomach. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Bellatrix's sharp words had once cut her in front of others. "Sissy, your devotion is nothing if you're not willing to risk everything for the Dark Lord." Narcissa had let the insult pass, though it stung, because arguing with Bellatrix was like trying to shout down a storm. Her sister thrived on dominance, and her loyalty to Voldemort was beyond even family ties, and yet despite this, they had shared blood, history, and an upbringing that few could understand. It was that shared history that made the loss so heavy. Narcissa remembered the three of them as girls, herself, Bellatrix, and Andromeda, gathered in the drawing room of their parents' house. Bellatrix had always been the ringleader, daring the others into mischief, dragging them into whispered games about dark magic long before they had wands of their own. Even when Narcissa had rolled her eyes or protested, Bellatrix's fierce will seemed impossible to resist. That energy had later turned into fanaticism, and Narcissa had often found herself in the shadow of her sister's dangerous choices. When Andromeda was disowned for marrying a Muggle-born, Bellatrix had spat curses into the air, declaring her sister dead to the family. Narcissa had been quieter, more restrained, but she had let the bond between the three of them fracture beyond repair. In some ways, losing Bellatrix now felt like losing that last thread to the days when they had been young and unbroken. The Black family's tangled loyalties had splintered them, and now there would be no chance of repairing what was lost. During the battle itself, Narcissa had not fought like Bellatrix. Her role had been smaller, more deliberate. She had lied to Voldemort, telling him Harry Potter was dead, an act that had nothing to do with loyalty to the Dark Lord and everything to do with her son. In that moment, she had chosen family over ideology, something Bellatrix would never have done. It was a choice that separated them irrevocably, and yet it made the finality of Bellatrix's death no less jarring. She knew that even if her sister had survived, they would never have seen the world the same way again. Narcissa found herself replaying the moment Molly Weasley struck Bellatrix down. It had been sudden, a duel of sheer fury and maternal protectiveness. The line from Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows echoed in her mind. "Not my daughter, you bitch!" And then, in a flash of light, the battle was over for Bellatrix. Narcissa did not blame Molly. She knew, in the deepest part of her, that Bellatrix's own violence had invited her fate, but it was strange to think of her sister, who had survived Azkaban and the most dangerous years of the war, being felled in a single moment by the very love she had always scorned. In the weeks afterward, Narcissa noticed a quietness in herself that went beyond grief. It was not the kind of mourning that inspired tears or outward displays. It was more like the dimming of a lamp, a subtle reduction in the energy she carried. Bellatrix had always been a force that filled rooms, sometimes with danger, sometimes with unwelcome intensity. And now that force was gone. Narcissa felt its absence in the strange stillness that clung to the halls of Malfoy Manor. She also could not help but remember the last conversation she had with Bellatrix before the battle. It had been tense, almost confrontational, as Bellatrix demanded to know if Narcissa truly believed in the Dark Lord's cause. Narcissa had evaded the question, focusing instead on Draco's safety, and Bellatrix had scoffed. That scoff lingered in her memory, sharper than she wished. They had parted without resolution, without the kind of words that might have softened the blow of what was to come. What made the loss more complex was that Narcissa never idolized Bellatrix, even in death. There were no rose-colored memories, no illusions that her sister had been anything other than destructive. Bellatrix had been dangerous to her enemies and to her own family, her obsession with Voldemort eclipsing any sense of balance or compassion. Narcissa was honest with herself about that. But the absence of love did not erase the reality of loss. The death of a sibling carves something out of a person, whether they wish to acknowledge it or not. In quieter moments, Narcissa found herself thinking of Andromeda, the last surviving sister. The thought of reaching out crossed her mind more than once, but she never acted on it. Too much stood between them, years of silence, the chasm of political and moral differences, the unhealed wound of Andromeda's marriage. Andromeda, she knew, had lost a daughter in the war. Tonks had fallen in the same battle that claimed Bellatrix. There was a bitter symmetry in that, though Narcissa doubted it would bring them together. The war had left her family shattered. Lucius was diminished, stripped of his influence and haunted by their failures. Draco was withdrawn, trying to navigate a world where the Malfoy name inspired suspicion, and Narcissa herself carried the quiet weight of a sister's death that could never be neatly mourned. The emptiness Bellatrix left behind was not the emptiness of a cherished figure, but it was emptiness all the same. She sometimes wondered if Bellatrix, in her final moments, had felt fear. It was hard to imagine. Bellatrix had always worn her fearlessness like armor, even in Azkaban. But death has a way of stripping even the fiercest of their illusions. Narcissa did not dwell on the thought for long. It was too strange to imagine her sister as anything but defiant, even at the very end. In the months that followed, Narcissa's detachment deepened. Those who knew her might have mistaken it for coldness, but it was a shield, a way to keep the ache from showing. She had learned long ago that in her world, grief was a private matter, not to be paraded before others. Yet there were nights when she would walk the halls of Malfoy Manor and pause at the places where she and Bellatrix had once stood. Together, moments from years past, pressing unbidden into her mind. It was not forgiveness she felt for her sister, nor was it admiration. It was something more complicated, the acknowledgement that Bellatrix had been an unshakable part of her life's landscape. Now that she was gone, the terrain had shifted, leaving Narcissa on uncertain ground. And though she would never speak it aloud, she missed the certainty of her sister's presence, even when that presence was a storm. Number 24. Strict Mistress of Malfoy Manor. The white peacocks roamed the manicured lawns of Malfoy Manor, as though they were as much part of the estate as the marble columns and tall windows that looked over Wiltshire's rolling green. Narcissa Malfoy, with her icy composure and impeccable attire, saw to it that not a single detail of her home was left to chance. Even in the darkest years of the Second Wizarding War, when shadows lengthened over Britain and the Malfoy estate became a gathering place for Lord Voldemort's inner circle, the house remained a masterpiece of elegance. The black and white tiles of the entrance hall gleamed as though freshly polished each morning, the antique candelabras burned with steady light, and the vast drawing room was always in perfect order. To Narcissa this was not vanity, it was a statement. Cleanliness, order, and beauty were weapons in their own right, reflecting the power and prestige of the Malfoy family. Visitors who stepped into the grand hall were met with the cold splendor of a place that seemed immune to the chaos of the outside world. The silver serpent motifs on the railings glistened under the chandelier's crystal light, and the heavy draperies were drawn with precision, not a wrinkle or dust mote to be seen. Even when Severus Snape arrived on a cold winter's night to meet Voldemort in the drawing room, the house appeared as though prepared for a royal audience. Narcissa understood that such surroundings exerted an unspoken pressure on guests. A home in such pristine condition whispered of control, of resources, of a family that could maintain refinement in times when others faltered. Her approach to the manor was almost ritualistic. The library's shelves were dusted daily, the portraits polished so the painted eyes of Malfoy ancestors could watch over events with clarity. The gardens were kept in perfect symmetry, every hedge clipped, every marble statue spotless, as if nature itself bent to her will. Even the dungeons beneath the manor, though grim, were ordered with the same fastidiousness, chains aligned, floors scrubbed, the cold stone kept dry and free of mould. This was not merely an obsession with tidiness. Narcissa believed the house was an extension of the family's reputation. If the manor showed neglect, it would imply weakness. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the drawing room of Malfoy Manor is described as large and sumptuously decorated, with a magnificent carpet covering most of the stone floor. The description may seem brief, but it hints at the standard Narcissa upheld. That sumptuousness was not accidental, it was the product of her daily vigilance. Even when her home became a headquarters for Voldemort's Death Eaters, with the Dark Lord himself sitting beneath the great chandelier, the room reflected her priorities. The silver and green decor remained undisturbed, the furniture arranged with the precision of a military formation. It was a reminder that the Malfoys were hosts, yes, but never servants. Her devotion to the manor's appearance was, in truth, a layer of armor. During the war, when fear and uncertainty gnawed at her family, Narcissa could not control the tide of events, but she could control the gleam of the marble floors, the order of the silverware, the perfect arrangement of flowers in the crystal vases. It was an act of defiance against the chaos outside the gates. Every polished surface, every aligned chair, was a silent declaration that the Malfoys would not be reduced to the level of common desperation. There was an unspoken understanding in the way the house ran. The house elves, led by the ever-efficient Dobby before his departure, and later by unnamed replacements, followed her commands to the letter. Narcissa's word was law in the household. Meals were served at precise hours, the linens were of the finest quality, and replaced at the first sign of wear, and the air always carried the faintest hint of enchanted lilies, her preferred scent. Guests like Bellatrix Lestrange, whose energy was wild and destructive, found themselves strangely contained within the manor's walls. Narcissa's order imposed itself, and even Bellatrix's chaos seemed lessened in such surroundings. One evening, when Voldemort summoned his followers to the manor to announce the capture of Charity Burbage, the teacher from Hogwarts, the house was in a state of flawless readiness. The long table in the dining room gleamed under candlelight, the silver goblets perfectly aligned. The scene was nightmarish in its juxtaposition, polished elegance surrounding an act of cruelty. Yet that was precisely how Narcissa intended it. The grandeur reminded everyone present that they were in the home of a family of status, not in some squalid hideout. It reinforced the unbroken prestige of the Malfoy name. The upkeep of Malfoy Manor was also a calculated political move. Voldemort valued loyalty, but he also valued appearances. A household in disarray would be a poor reflection on its owners, suggesting incompetence or weakness. Narcissa made sure that every time the Dark Lord crossed her threshold, he was met with the silent message that the Malfoys were unshaken, their resources intact, their place in the hierarchy unquestionable. Even in the eyes of other Death Eaters like Lucius's old-school friends, the state of the manor was proof that the Malfoys remained above the rest. Her sense of responsibility toward the manor extended beyond aesthetics. In her mind, the estate embodied the history of the Malfoy line. The portraits told stories of generations who had navigated the shifting tides of wizarding politics. The silverware had been passed down for centuries, each piece engraved with the Malfoy crest. Even the peacocks were part of that legacy, symbols of aristocracy and rare beauty. To let the manor fall into neglect would have been, in Narcissa's eyes, to betray her ancestors. In private moments, Narcissa took comfort in her home's order. The quiet rhythm of the household was a counterbalance to the fear that Voldemort's presence brought. She could sit in the morning room, tea steaming in her cup, and know that the floors beneath her feet were spotless, the fire perfectly banked, the curtains drawn at the exact angle she preferred. It gave her the illusion, however fleeting, that she was still in control of her life. The manor was her domain, and no matter what else happened, it would remain a place that reflected her will. Even Draco's safety was, in her mind, linked to the manor. If the house remained a symbol of strength and stability, it would be harder for enemies, whether political or personal, to see them as vulnerable. She believed that the home's appearance could shield her family, at least in part, from the perception of weakness that could invite attack. In this way, polishing the floors and overseeing the gardens became acts of maternal protection as much as they were gestures of pride. The Death Eaters who frequented the manor noticed this atmosphere, though few would admit it. The house seemed to command a kind of grudging respect. Its grandeur set the tone for meetings, forcing even the most ruthless among them to sit a little straighter, to lower their voices, to tread carefully on the carpets that muffled their steps. It was as though the manor itself, through Narcissa's care, demanded decorum. Even Voldemort, who cared little for beauty, conducted his business here in an uncharacteristic calm, the setting subtly influencing the tone of his commands. The most telling moment came during the final months of the war, when the Malfoys' fortunes were at their lowest. Lucius was disgraced in Voldemort's eyes, Draco was under constant scrutiny, and Narcissa herself lived in a state of quiet desperation. Yet the manor did not reflect their fear. It stood as polished and imposing as ever, its chandeliers blazing, its halls free of dust. This was no accident. It was Narcissa's deliberate choice to keep up the illusion of power. She knew that the walls could not physically defend her family, but the image they projected could. After the war, when the Malfoys withdrew from public life, Malfoy Manor remained untouched by the ravages of time that claimed so many other old estates. The gardens still bloomed in precise patterns, the windows still caught the sunlight in perfect symmetry. Those who passed through its gates saw no trace of the desperate bargains and dangerous guests that had once filled its rooms. It was as if Narcissa had erased the past with polish and order, reclaiming her home as a place of dignity. In the end, Malfoy Manor was not just the setting of her life, it was her greatest work, a fortress of beauty in which every detail was a testament to the resilience of the woman who ruled it. Number 25. Silent observer. Narcissa Malfoy was never the loudest voice in the room. In the chaos of the Second Wizarding War, her presence often seemed secondary, a pale figure standing just behind her husband Lucius, or beside her son Draco. Yet in the intricate web of alliances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties that defined Voldemort's rise and fall, she was far from passive. She was the silent observer, the one who could read the smallest movements, who noticed, who avoided whose eyes, and who remembered every whisper that might matter later. In the Malfoy household, this quiet awareness was not a weakness, it was a weapon. Her value as a witness to the private workings of Voldemort's circle came from her careful restraint. She rarely spoke in public gatherings of the Death Eaters, allowing men like Bellatrix Lestrange to dominate the conversation. But when she listened, she truly listened. She would note how Fenrir Greyback lingered too close to certain allies, how the Carrow twins exchanged glances when a plan sounded risky, and how, even among Voldemort's most loyal servants, there was a subtle hierarchy of trust. In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, when Snape swore the unbreakable vow with her, it was not an impulsive act on her part. It was calculated. She knew what it meant for Draco to be given his task, and she knew who would protect him when Lucius could not. Narcissa's position was unique because she belonged to a pure-blood family deeply rooted in old wizarding politics. Her marriage to Lucius had bound her to the Malfoy name, but her own black family heritage gave her insight into multiple circles of influence. She had grown up watching her cousin Sirius rebel, her cousin Bellatrix embrace fanaticism, and her sister Andromeda be cast out for marrying a Muggle-born. She understood that trust was rarely absolute, even among family. That awareness shaped her view of Voldemort's followers. She did not assume loyalty simply because someone bore the dark mark. The most telling example of her role as an observer comes during the events of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. After the Battle of the Seven Potters, when Voldemort's control was tightening and the Malfoy family's standing had diminished, Narcissa still stood among the Death Eaters at the Malfoy Manor. The scene when Harry, Ron, and Hermione are captured and brought there shows her restraint at its sharpest. Bellatrix is hysterical over the sword of Gryffindor, Greyback is eager for violence, and Lucius is desperate to regain Voldemort's favour. But Narcissa does not rush forward with accusations or demands. She watches. She evaluates. She notices the hesitation in Draco's voice when asked to identify Harry. She says nothing, but she remembers. Her silence was not born from fear alone, it was strategic. She had learned that speaking too quickly in Voldemort's court was dangerous. The Dark Lord rewarded information but punished weakness, and too much eagerness could be mistaken for the latter. So she positioned herself as the one who spoke only when she had something worth saying. It made her words carry weight when they did come. This is why, during the final battle, her quiet question to Harry, "Is Draco alive?" was so powerful. She had observed the chaos around her, gauged Voldemort's focus, and realized that her son's safety mattered more than any oath or ideology. Her ability to see through the noise of the war came from the same skill that made her dangerous as a witness. She noticed relationships. She knew which alliances were brittle, like the one between Lucius and Yaxley, strained by ambition and mistrust. She saw the uneasy loyalty between Snape and the Death Eaters, sensing that his allegiance was not as pure as he claimed, and she understood that Voldemort himself, for all his power, trusted almost no one. This knowledge meant she could anticipate where cracks might form. In the politics of the Death Eaters, such foresight was rare. It is telling that Voldemort never truly considered Narcissa a threat. He underestimated her because she did not openly challenge him, did not argue in meetings, and did not seek his favor like Bellatrix. But underestimation was her shield. Her mind worked in the background, connecting details others ignored. She would recall who flinched when Voldemort spoke of punishment, who asked too many questions about plans, and who conveniently avoided certain missions. These fragments of observation gave her a private map of the shifting loyalties around her. Even within her own family, Narcissa's quiet watching shaped her choices. She noticed the toll Draco's task took on him in his 6th year, the way his hands shook, the sleepless nights, the fear behind his pride. While Lucius was consumed by his own humiliation after failing Voldemort, Narcissa watched her son deteriorate and began to plot how to shield him. Her decision to seek out Snape was not born of trust in him, but from a recognition that he was the only one with both the skill and the position to help Draco survive. As she told him in Half-Blood Prince, "If you are there to protect him, swear it. Make the unbreakable vow." In this moment, she demonstrated her understanding of power dynamics. She knew Bellatrix would try to dissuade her, that Lucius could not act, and that Voldemort's orders were absolute. But she also knew that in the shadows of the Dark Lord's war machine, there were small spaces for maneuvering, if one was careful. She placed her trust in Snape not because she believed him entirely loyal to the Malfoys, but because she had measured him and judged that his interests aligned with hers for the time being. Narcissa's observational power came into sharp focus in the Forbidden Forest during the final confrontation, when Voldemort sent Harry, whom he believed dead, into the castle to display his victory. Narcissa approached him. She bent down, close enough to see his face, and asked the question that mattered most to her. Was Draco still alive? When Harry confirmed he was, she made her choice. She lied to Voldemort, telling him Harry was dead. This was not just a mother's desperate act, it was the culmination of years of watching, measuring, and knowing when to act. She recognized the battle was lost for Voldemort, and that the only path to her son's survival was to end the fight quickly. This decision was shaped by every quiet moment she had spent as a witness to Voldemort's world. She knew the Dark Lord's arrogance, knew his tendency to overlook what he saw as lesser players, and she exploited that. By telling him what he wanted to hear, she secured a chance to walk away from the war with her family intact. She had always been a survivor, but survival for her meant more than living. It meant keeping those she loved alive. Her alliance with Harry in that moment was unspoken but undeniable. Years earlier, she would never have imagined protecting the boy who had defied Voldemort so often. But her understanding of trust had always been situational. She did not believe in absolute loyalty to a cause. She believed in loyalty to people, and only to those who had earned it. In that forest, Harry became one of those people, if only for the few minutes it took to walk back to the castle. This is why Narcissa was both a dangerous witness and a reliable ally. To those she distrusted, her silence was impenetrable. To those she chose to help, her knowledge could be a shield. Her quiet watchfulness meant she could predict dangers before they arrived. In the shifting alliances of the war, this made her an asset worth far more than brute force or loud declarations of loyalty. The tragedy for Voldemort was that he never understood this until it was too late. She carried the lessons of her youth, the volatile politics of the Black family, the dangers of open defiance, the value of holding one's tongue, into every room she entered. Her composure made her hard to read, but it also meant she could gather information without drawing suspicion. For someone like Narcissa, survival was not just about magic or bloodline, it was about perception, and perception, once sharpened, became her most dangerous magic of all. In the end, Narcissa's story in the saga is not one of spells cast or battles fought. It is the story of a woman who, by standing slightly in the background, saw more than most of those in the spotlight. She used that knowledge sparingly but decisively, and when the moment came to choose between her allegiance to Voldemort and the life of her son, her years of careful observation made the decision clear. She had always known who she could trust and who could trust her. In the shadows, she had already shaped the outcome. Number 26. Contrast with her husband. Lucius Malfoy's presence in the world of Harry Potter is one of sharp arrogance and cultivated grandeur, yet beneath the glittering surface of his status lies a dangerous flaw: his tendency to let pride dictate his actions. In contrast, Narcissa Malfoy, often seen only as a cold, elegant figure on the sidelines, reveals herself to be a master of measured strategy. This contrast between husband and wife became a lifeline for their family when the shifting tides of Voldemort's return threatened to crush them. Lucius's ambition had led him to overstep in the Second Wizarding War, while Narcissa's calm and calculated approach repeatedly kept their family from collapsing entirely. One might even say that without her subtle interventions, the Malfoys' fate would have been sealed far sooner. When Lucius placed the diary of Tom Riddle into Ginny Weasley's possession during the events of Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, he acted out of a dangerous combination of vanity and opportunism. He sought to damage the Weasleys and curry favour with Voldemort's old designs without fully understanding the artifact's true danger. His pride in striking a blow against enemies of proper wizarding society blinded him to the possibility that this act could spiral out of his control. It did, of course, and the reopening of the chamber drew unwanted scrutiny to the Malfoy name. Narcissa, while not directly involved, saw firsthand the way Lucius's impulsive choices could attract the wrong kind of attention. Her silence in those days was not indifference, it was calculation. She understood that preserving the family's image sometimes meant allowing her husband to stand in the fire alone while she shielded their son from the sparks. By the time Voldemort returned in Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Lucius was eager to resume his place in the Dark Lord's inner circle. He believed his position in society and his history of service would restore him to favour. Narcissa, however, was not swept up by the euphoria that gripped many of the Death Eaters. She read the signs more clearly than her husband. Her concern was not for the ideological victory Voldemort promised, but for the practical consequences. What would this mean for Draco? While Lucius relished being part of a cause that allowed him to flaunt his power, Narcissa measured each move by its potential to safeguard her only child. She did not oppose Lucius openly, but her restraint created a quiet counterweight to his recklessness. Lucius's downfall came in the Department of Mysteries in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Acting under Voldemort's orders to retrieve the prophecy, he was caught in the battle against the members of Dumbledore's army and the Order itself. It was a mission that demanded stealth and precision, yet Lucius allowed his arrogance to dictate his behaviour. His taunting of Harry, his underestimation of the opposition, and his faith in sheer intimidation ended in disaster. Captured and publicly disgraced, he lost not only his freedom, but also his standing in Voldemort's eyes. For a man like Lucius, the humiliation was shattering. For Narcissa, it was a clear signal. She would have to maneuver carefully to keep Draco, and by extension the Malfoy name, safe from the consequences of her husband's failure. It is in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince that Narcissa's skill in calculated action becomes fully visible. When Voldemort assigned Draco the task of killing Dumbledore, it was not a mark of favour, it was a death sentence, punishment for Lucius's mistakes. Lucius had failed in the ministry, failed to secure the prophecy, and now his family was being used to prove loyalty through sacrifice. Here, Narcissa acted in a way Lucius never would have. She sought help in secret. Her visit to Severus Snape's home, accompanied by Bellatrix Lestrange, was a masterstroke of quiet rebellion. She did not confront Voldemort directly, nor did she refuse the task outright. Instead, she secured a vow from Snape, the unbreakable vow, that he would protect Draco and, if necessary, complete the mission himself. This act was not only brave, but shrewd. Narcissa understood that public defiance would doom them, but subtle agreements could bend the rules of survival. "If Draco fails, will you kill him?" she asked Snape, forcing him into a binding promise. In this moment, she was not the silent wife of a disgraced Death Eater. She was the strategist ensuring her child would live, regardless of the Dark Lord's will. Lucius, imprisoned and stripped of his influence, could not have imagined such a plan. His pride would never have allowed him to appear weak enough to beg for assistance. Narcissa, on the other hand, valued results over appearances. Throughout Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the contrast between Lucius's faltering bravado and Narcissa's quiet determination grew starker. The Malfoy home became a base for Voldemort's forces, and the couple was drawn ever deeper into danger. Lucius, desperate to regain favor, bent under the Dark Lord's commands, his eyes haunted and his voice stripped of the authority he once wielded. Narcissa, though equally trapped, did not cling to the idea of restoring past glories. She focused on one goal: getting her family out alive. Her composure in the face of Voldemort's demands was not born of loyalty, but of the knowledge that fear and desperation could be weapons if handled correctly. Her defining moment came on the battlefield at Hogwarts. When Voldemort believed Harry was dead, he ordered Narcissa to check his body. Leaning close to the boy, she whispered a single question: "Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle?" Upon hearing Harry's answer, that Draco was safe, she declared to Voldemort, "He is dead." In that instant she committed the ultimate betrayal against the Dark Lord, and she did it without hesitation. It was the culmination of years of quiet strategy, knowing when to act, when to speak, and when to let others underestimate her. Lucius had once acted for pride and position. Narcissa acted for survival, and her choice saved not only her son but the lives of many others. The difference in their methods is as stark as the difference in their temperaments. Lucius's impulsive moves often came from a desire to display power, to assert dominance in the social hierarchy of the wizarding world. Narcissa's moves were deliberate, aimed at producing specific outcomes, often by using that same social hierarchy to her advantage. While Lucius thrived on being seen, Narcissa thrived on being overlooked until the moment came to strike. This balance, however uneasy, allowed them to endure. His ambition opened doors, her caution ensured they could walk back through them if needed. Even in the quiet domestic sphere, the contrast shaped their household. Draco grew up idolizing his father's polished power, yet relying on his mother's steadiness. When Lucius spoke of blood purity and wizarding supremacy, it was Narcissa who taught Draco the more subtle arts of self-preservation. She may have shared her husband's beliefs to a degree, but she never allowed them to override the central truth of her existence: family above ideology. That truth was what ultimately severed her loyalty to Voldemort. Lucius's missteps could have destroyed them entirely if Narcissa had not been there to absorb the shocks. When the Ministry raided their home, when Draco faltered under the weight of his mission, when Voldemort's wrath threatened to consume them, it was Narcissa who adjusted course. She did so not with grand gestures, but with quiet negotiations, secret assurances, and a willingness to bend the rules that Lucius once held rigidly. Her ability to adapt made her an anomaly in the rigid world of pure-blood politics. Even after the war, when the Malfoys retreated from public life, the same dynamic persisted. Lucius, shamed and broken, no longer sought the spotlight. Narcissa, in her calm, calculated way, managed the family's slow withdrawal from the ruins of their former influence. She maintained their dignity where possible, avoided public confrontations, and ensured Draco's path forward was not hindered by his father's history. It was damage control on the grandest scale, continuation of the same survival instinct she had exercised under Voldemort's rule. Theirs was not a partnership of equals in temperament, but it was a partnership nonetheless. Lucius provided the ambition and connections that placed the Malfoys in positions of influence. Narcissa provided the restraint and strategic thinking that kept them from losing everything when those positions became precarious. Each relied on the other, though in vastly different ways. Without Lucius, Narcissa might never have been tested in such dangerous arenas. Without Narcissa, Lucius might never have survived his own mistakes. Ultimately, the Malfoys' survival through 2 wizarding wars was not the result of unbroken loyalty to Voldemort, nor of sheer magical prowess. It was the product of a delicate balance between impulsive ambition, and cold calculation. Lucius often acted as the sword, sharp and quick but prone to shattering under pressure. Narcissa acted as the shield, absorbing the blows and turning them aside until an escape route could be found. In the end, it was the shield that proved decisive. And in the shadows of that shield, the Malfoy name, battered, diminished, yet still standing, endured. Number 27. Quiet exit from politics. After the Battle of Hogwarts, Narcissa Malfoy's name was not one that appeared in the Prophet Society pages. In fact, it began to vanish almost entirely from public life, fading quietly into the background of wizarding society. Those who remembered the pale, elegant woman standing in the shadow of her husband at ministry galas found themselves wondering if they had imagined her altogether. It was not coincidence. It was calculated retreat. Narcissa had watched the war scorch her family's name and had no intention of letting the flames touch her son again. The ministry's amnesty, earned in no small part due to her lie to Voldemort about Harry Potter being dead, offered a narrow path forward, but only if she kept herself far from the political spotlight. And so she chose absence as her weapon. The decision was not born of fear alone. Those who knew her understood that Narcissa was far from a passive figure in her household. Throughout the war, she had been one of the few in Voldemort's circle who acted not from ideology, but from fierce, almost blinding maternal instinct. The scene in the forest when she leaned over Harry's seemingly lifeless body and whispered, "Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle?" was not an act of loyalty to the Dark Lord, but of complete disregard for him. Once Harry whispered, "Yes," she rose, walked back to the enemy camp, and told Voldemort what he wanted to hear. That choice, quiet and unflinching, saved her family from certain destruction. It also convinced her that silence could be more powerful than words. In the aftermath. In the months after Voldemort's defeat, the Malfoy name was still heavy with suspicion. Lucius was summoned repeatedly to answer questions about the family's role in the war. Draco was scrutinized at every turn. His time as a reluctant Death Eater was remembered far more vividly than any attempts at redemption. Narcissa saw what these encounters did to her son. She noticed the way he avoided conversation and the way his jaw tensed when a stranger's eyes lingered too long. And so she took control in the way she knew best, by deciding who could enter their world at all. Invitations to public events were declined without hesitation. Friends who had once been constant fixtures at Malfoy Manor were received only in private, in settings Narcissa could manage. It was as if she had built a new ward around her family, one made not of magic, but of deliberate distance. The wizarding world, of course, noticed. The gossip columns began to speculate. Some claimed that Narcissa was ashamed to show her face. Others believed she was orchestrating an elaborate rebranding for the Malfoys, waiting for the scandal to fade before stepping back into public life. Both theories missed the truth. Narcissa had no interest in returning. The war had stripped away any illusions she once had about the nobility of pure blood politics. The balls, the speeches, the ceremonial appearances, they were nothing but stages for manipulation and quiet threats. She had seen those stages turn into battlegrounds. She wanted no part of them anymore. One particularly telling moment came 2 years after the war. The ministry planned a memorial gala to honor those who had fought against Voldemort. Invitations were extended widely, even to controversial families, as a gesture of reconciliation. The prophet reported that Lucius and Draco would attend. When the night arrived, only the 2 men appeared. Narcissa was nowhere to be seen. The absence sparked murmurs among the guests. The official explanation, mainly that she had been unwell, was politely accepted, but it was clear that the choice was deliberate. In avoiding the event, Narcissa refused to be part of a performance she didn't believe in. She had no desire to stand in a room where names like Bellatrix Lestrange would hang unspoken in the air, where her family's past alliances would be measured against the grief of others. Her withdrawal did not mean isolation from everyone. She still maintained relationships with a few trusted figures, many of them tied to her through old family connections rather than political ones. Astoria Greengrass, who would later marry Draco, was one such presence. Narcissa approved of her quiet strength and her refusal to engage in the more toxic traditions of pure blood society. Visits between the Greengrass estate and Malfoy Manor became a small refuge for both women, far from the eyes of those eager to dissect their every move. These controlled settings allowed Narcissa to keep conversation. Safe. No mention of Azkaban, no whispered questions about the night in the Forbidden Forest, no speculation about the loyalty of the Malfoys.